Kingsley, thank you very, very much for your opening statement. We'll go to a 7th round. Mr. Lukiski, you're starting us off today.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Mr. Kingsley, for being here. It's good to see you again. Mr. Kingsley, one of the things we haven't heard much of in the examination of this bill is the changes the bill proposes to the political financing regime. And I think that's a very important aspect of this bill. So I'd like to get your take on that. I'd like to get your analysis on the changes that this bill proposes, particularly on the attempt to take big money out of the election financing regime, particularly taking big money out from corporations and unions, and to also ensure that political parties are not able to skirt donation limits through unpaid loans, which we have seen in years past, and testamentary donations. Could you please comment on what your analysis of this bill does with regard to those items?
Well, I think I alluded to loans and unpaid claims, and loans become unpaid claims after 3 years. In my view, this is a very good attempt to come to grips with the problem which exists when you have a regime that regulates money as well as a Canadian system does. Our system, frankly, is the best in the world. It's as simple as that. And this bill does not affect that, in my view. The limits are increased in certain places. I find that acceptable. They do not thwart the purpose of the regime. And with respect to loans, several measures are put in place here so that there is less of a need for loans. As well, the fact that the loans can come from financial institutions only. This is all meant to prevent the back door to the scheme that we've come up with, this very good system that we've got to regulate money. And I think that the bill is a reasonable attempt to come to grips with this. I think your committee should be looking at this in a year or two, or several years after the next general election, to see how well people were able to adapt to that.
Just for the purposes of those Canadians who may be watching and listening who aren't aware of how political parties and candidates, frankly, in the past have been able to skirt donation limits through unpaid loans, could you please give an example? I know we've had, for example, many questions and many comments that all parties have made criticizing the Liberals because of unpaid leadership loans in the past. Could you just give perhaps a framework of how the current system works and how it can be abused and how the changes in this bill would regulate those?
Well, I'm sure Canadians who follow this are aware of this, but essentially the issue is that when there are leadership campaigns, especially when there are other candidacies as well just to be elected to the House, one can obtain loans, and the regime for reimbursement has not been clear under the statute, and therefore some of those loans have remained unpaid over time, and the Chief Electoral Officer has told us that the regime is unenforceable. I must accept that, and therefore this is why I consider this a very reasonable attempt to come to grips with that.
In other words, just how much time do we have, Chair?
3.5.
Thank you. With respect to unpaid loans, in the case of some of the former Liberal leadership candidates, those loans have been unpaid for several years. And most, I think, reasonable people would assume that if you haven't paid a loan back within a reasonable amount of time, that individual or the party, if there's a case of a party, but usually as candidates, should face some sanctions. That has not happened. In other words, you can have an individual who still owes hundreds of thousands of dollars from loans that he received during his or her leadership bid that have been unpaid for several years, and they face absolutely no sanctions. One of the things that obviously it appears to me should be done is to then consider those unpaid loans as to be contributions. So what do you see in this bill that helps address the problems that we've faced for the last number of years with respect to particularly unpaid leadership candidate loans?
Well, number one, only a financial institution which will establish the risk and determine what it is that they think it thinks is a reasonable loan can make a loan, or individuals, but individuals can only make a loan or offer a loan guarantee up to the limit of $1,500 for that year, which is what they're entitled to. So this will obviously obviate the need and obviously remove the capacity for individuals or corporations or others except for financial institutions, for making any kind of substantial loan to a candidate or to a leadership candidate.
Thank you. Finally, if I could just change to a different element of the bill very, very quickly. That's on the changes that we have in the bill to try and prevent the problems we saw with robocalling and the Pierre Poutine example in the last election. Could you comment briefly on why the changes we are proposing in this bill would help, I guess, help prevent those types of situations from occurring again in the future?
Well, the bill will require that people who offer the services that are called robocall services, automated calls, must register with the CRTC. They must file their names. People who retain their services must also be known. The messages must be kept. Under the present bill for 1 year, I recommended that it should be something akin to 10, which is the length of time that an actual investigation and prosecution can take place. There's not much point in keeping it for 1 year. So many things can happen quite rapidly in 1 year. The time has elapsed. So I would urge your committee to consider that. And therefore, for all those reasons, it becomes a traceable item. Obviously, if someone is doing it without doing all those things, they're breaking the law, and this is where people will have to step in. I'm also recommending that the numbers that were called be kept so that that trail can be followed right to the people who received the call so that they can tell the investigators what it is they remember about that call.
30 seconds.
In your opinion, then, the changes that we are proposing, would they help ultimately prevent the same Pierre Poutine situation we saw in the last federal election?
Yes, they would.
Thank you.